Today on Ascend the Great Books podcast, we are doing something fun and a bit different. I am joined by Alberto Fernandez, the Vice President of the Middle East Media Research Institute, to discuss the life and philosophy of Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian. We'll discuss Howard's life, his philosophy, and one of his best stories, The Tower of the Elephant. We'll consider Howard's contrast of barbarism and civilization, his friendship with H.P. Lovecraft, and whether there's an imprint of Nietzsche upon his writings. So join us today for an excellent conversation on Conan the Barbarian and the Tower of the Elephant. Welcome to Ascend the Great Books podcast. My name is Deacon Garlick. I'm a husband, father, and serve as the Chancellor and General Counsel for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Tulsa. We're recording on a beautiful afternoon here at the Chancery. If you're new to Ascend, we are a weekly podcast that helps guide you through the great books. We have just finished a year with Homer, reading both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we'll be reading Hesiod's Theogony and Aeschylus's Oresteia next. For more information, check us out on X or Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and Patreon. We appreciate all of our supporters. And you can check us out on thegreatbookspodcast.com, where we have written guides and other resources to help guide you through the great books. Today we're doing something fun. Today we're discussing the author Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian. We'll be looking at his life, his philosophy, and discussing one of his most famous works, The Tower of the Elephant. We have a wonderful guest today. We have Alberto Fernandez, who serves as the Vice President of the Middle East Media Research Institute. He is also doing work with EWTN on the Middle East and has several articles in the Lamp magazine. Alberto, how are you today?
Great. I'm delighted to be on with you. I'm a big admirer of your work, and I love the Odyssey and the Iliad. But
you gravitate more towards the Odyssey than the Iliad?
Yes, I kind of do. I don't know, maybe because I'm a father, because I was an American diplomat for many years, and I was not gone for 20 years, but I was away from my family sometimes.
Right. You have some empathy for Odysseus?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. My secret understanding is basically I like whichever one I read last, whichever one I've kind of worked through. I will say with our year with Homer, I greatly appreciated the Iliad this time because I read it in a small group with a group of men, including with the podcast. I think it really came alive, right? Reading the classics with friends, iron sharpening iron. The texts, it's like if you read a text with three friends, it's like you've read it 4 times, right?
Yeah.
You see all these things. And I really enjoyed the camaraderie in the Iliad this year, particularly like also the comparison between Achilles and Hector. That just really captured my attention.
I love them both, and I have the same reaction that you have. I actually reread the Odyssey, the Green, is Peter Green? Which Green is it?
Oh yeah, Green, yeah.
Translation, and I really enjoyed it. So that's the most recent one I read as well.
That's very good. Do you have like a favorite Homeric character or someone who stands out to you?
I mean, it would have to be Odysseus, as I said. I mean, in the Iliad, there are many, that strike a chord, including Odysseus, by the way. So it's hard to pick one, though. They're all great, and the translations are all fascinating. I enjoy them all. I have the T.E. Lawrence, T.E. Shaw Odyssey as well, which is prose version, which is also fun to read.
Yeah, no, very good. Yeah, I think I'm still kind of caught up with Hector in my imagination. Like, I just really appreciated him as a contrast. I really like Diomedes in the Iliad. It's just hard not to like him when he kind of goes, on his kind of zenith of RSA. It's really wonderful. Odysseus, I just don't know. When you read the Iliad, we've talked about you really are comparing Achilles and Hector. When you read the Odyssey, you're really comparing Odysseus to Odysseus. Just sometimes he's great, sometimes it's just a big misstep. And but he reminds me too of, not to be overly critical of him, because he reminds me a lot of so many of the Old Testament characters. that, you root for, but then they just make profound mistakes, but Providence, can still work through them.
I think that's exactly part of the attraction I have for Odysseus is he is so flawed, he kind of, I hate a lot of people do this, so I'm going to do something I hate. I hate to compare him to modern man, but that makes him seem a little more modern than the demigod Achilles, in my mind. It somehow makes him seem like, oh man, like you're really stupid. Why did you do that?
Yeah, I think one thing, sometimes in like modern literature, modern philosophy, we find ourselves to be very atomized from the ancients. Like we think we're like just very different. Like I can't, there's nothing I'm going to learn from reading Homer, right? What was Homer have anything to teach me? Like I'm a modern man, I have an iPhone, X, Y, and Z. And you only have to read like the first book of the Iliad to realize that nothing has changed with human nature. I mean, you look at these characters like Agamemnon or Odysseus or Achilles or Hector or even Patroclus, like you realize like, oh, yeah, I've met people like this. I've met people who are imploded or make decisions that are contrary to their own interests. Like, I think the best way to show that human nature hasn't changed is actually just to get someone to read Homer, and you like see how this like comes out. And then, yeah, you can have a lot of empathy with the characters. Yeah, very good. But today we're not discussing Homer. We are discussing Robert E. Howard, which might not be a name that a lot of people are familiar with. So can you kind of tee us up a bit? Like, who is Robert E. Howard and why should we read him?
Well, Robert E. Howard was an American writer, a Texan, who lived between 1906 and 1936. He only lived to be 30 years old. And he's a young man going out on the frontier of the western frontier in Texas at a time of, kind of when it was still a frontier place, a kind of cattle town and oil boom town. A young boy who loved to read adventure stories, loved poetry, and had a gift for writing. And he had a God-given gift, because, he studied, he went up to high school in small town Texas, although I imagine small town Texas 100 years ago, they probably had, a much better education, maybe much better reading education than many of us today. But he had a thirst for reading adventure stories, for reading poetry, and he wanted to be a writer, and he became a writer, and he was for the time extremely successful in the niche that he had. We can talk about things he accomplished as a writer, but he both wrote because he felt compelled to do so. From a very young age. I mean, we're talking like 11, 10, 12 years old. As I said, his first published story was he was 18 years old in a legitimate, publication. And he also wrote to live. He lived from his writing, and he had a lot, he lived during the Great Depression. So he had a lot of problems. He had a lot of family problems, a sickly mother, that we can get into all of that stuff. But he was a guy who was always writing, looking for new, markets to write his stuff. He would rewrite his stuff, resubmit it, try to publish a book. Only one book was published in his lifetime, or in the 1930s. But he is such a vivid writer, such a powerful writer, that this very kind of modest beginning. I mean, he wrote, all of his work was written in his teens or in his 20s. And yet they had a vividness and a power that they have survived and flourished. And, you talk, a lot of people don't know Robert E. Howard, but actually a lot of people do know Robert E. Howard, and there's a whole kind of world of Robert E. Howard. And every year in Texas they have Howard Days in his the little town where he grew up. He wasn't born there. He wasn't born in Cross Plains, Texas, but they celebrate it there. There's a whole kind of sub genre of his work and stuff like that. And I think today there's a kind of recognition that actually he was a writing talent. And you could say he was an adventure writer or a fantasy writer or a horror writer. or a writer of westerns, a writer of comic westerns. But, what might have been? Who knows what would have happened if he had lived longer?
No, very good. I appreciate that setup. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about like what his writing is. So like my understanding is like a lot of these things is the early 1900s. They're getting published in these kind of like pulp fiction magazines, which if someone's not familiar, there's like Weird Tales would be like a famous one. And it's pulp because it's a cheap paper. It's like a wood pulpy paper. So it's like very heavy. And so they're publishing these weird tales, if you will. And so he's writing, like you said, he's writing adventure stories. He has all kinds of characters, which is something I think we have to discuss at some point. He has lots of different characters. My understanding is that he basically, maybe not in the beginning, but as his own style develops, he basically invents the entire sword and sorcery genre. So a lot of times when we think about fantasy, we think about like high fantasy, we think about Tolkien and the kind of these large epics. But there's also, a history of going back to this sword and sorcery where really your hero is just a guy with a sword, right? It's a natural character. Usually they're not using magic. They're just a straightforward, a man with fortitude, raw strength that's going to overcome and overpower some kind of evil. And then like why it's sword and sorcery is because then that's all juxtaposed to some type of like dark arts and magic and weird things. And so you kind of see where maybe a character like Conan the Barbarian, right, would come out of this, and that he kind of single-handedly invented this genre.
Kind of did, and not precisely, because obviously there are antecedents before, in saga and in legend, and even in writers that were kind of roughly contemporary to Howard, people like E.R. Edison and people like that. But Howard's influence is huge. Some people have called it the hard-boiled school of fantasy, hard-boiled school of sword and sorcery, to contrast it to high fantasy, right? And yes, he was a writer of the pulps, and of course he's most identified with Weird Tales, which is, the legendary Weird Tales magazine, which had the three great figures of Weird Tales, Robert E. Howard, H.P. Lovecraft, and Clark Ashton Smith. Howard was very influenced by another pulp magazine, which was an adventure magazine, which was called Adventure. And in fact, he wrote adventure stories. He wrote kind of non-fantasy adventures, and he tried to get into adventure magazine. And he was influenced by writers who wrote there, people like Harold Lamb and Talbot Mundy, and older figures too, like, Henry Rider Haggard, pre-pulp era. But so in Conan and in Weird Tales, he found a market. He was always looking for other markets, but he was looking for markets that paid better, because Weird Tales didn't always pay on time. They paid on publication, so they owed him money. When he died, they still owed him like $1,000, $2,000, which in the Great Depression was a lot of money. But he's most identified with Weird Tales, and you're right. I mean, what he did is he kind of took the adventure story and kind of made it the fantasy adventure story, with elements of horror, with elements of magic. And like I said, not completely original from him, but he certainly deserves a lot of recognition as one of the great kind of fathers of this genre, which today is much, much better known.
You mentioned H.P. Lovecraft, which is another phenomenal author. I really enjoy reading his short stories as well. Kind of very different, that kind of like cosmic horror. But it's really interesting because when I was reading The Tower of the Elephant, and we'll kind of get into that, there's an element in that. I was like, man, this sounds very Lovecraftian. And then I realized, or I looked up, that they were actually friends, that Robert Howard and Lovecraft became friends. Is that correct?
Yeah, Howard admired, Howard is a younger person than Lovecraft, and Howard admired Lovecraft and basically wrote a letter to the editor of Weird Tales. He was already appearing in Weird Tales, praising Lovecraft. And Lovecraft was this, of course, maniacal letter writer, this kind of voluminous 6-volume work. I have it back here of Lovecraft's letters. And so they became pen pals, and you write long letters to each other, which each would talk about what they knew. So Howard would talk about Texas history and, barbarians and cowboys. Howard would talk about the Romans and horror and stuff like that. So Lovecraft Howard was influenced by Lovecraft. He was a very different writer, but they had a very good epistolary friendship. Sadly, they never met. And in fact, there was a time when Lovecraft made it to New Orleans, Louisiana. Howard didn't have a lot of money. Howard once went to New Orleans, I think when he was a kid, but Howard didn't have the money to go meet Lovecraft in New Orleans, which would have been fascinating reality if they had met. And I think somebody should write a pastiche or a modern fantasy about them meeting in New Orleans and having adventures and fighting monsters and kind of stuff like that. It'd be fun to read. But yeah, they were friends, kind of indirect friends through what we like, it's like Twitter friends today, right? So they were friends through epistolary means.
So are you a fan of Lovecraft as well?
I like Lovecraft. I like Lovecraft's work very much. I grew up reading both of them at about the same time in the 70s. I'm kind of an old guy, and there was a boom. There was a Howard boom. There was a Lovecraft boom, late 60s and 70s. A kind of rediscovery of these writers who were long dead and had been out of print for a long time. And they both kind of happened at the same time. So I picked them both up at the same time. And from my early teens is when I first read them. And I read them regularly, every once in a while for fun, or I'll read a Lovecraft story for Halloween or Russell Kirk for Halloween. And Howard always, I dip into him. It's fascinating because there are a lot, even when I was a kid, there are a lot of people who tried to write like Howard. So in the 70s, you had Thongor of Lemuria, or you had Brack the Barbarian. You had kind of ripoffs or copies or, riffs on Howard. And as a kid, I don't know about you when you were a kid. When I was a kid, I read everything, right? I just would just read all this stuff. Some of it was great. Some of it was garbage. As time goes on, you would realize, this guy is actually a really good writer. These other ones who are kind of producing stuff like him are not as good. And so you kind of, over time, you appreciate Howard for the gifted writer that he was, the writer that could kind of write action, write violence. His descriptive powers were considerable.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really impressed me about reading Howard, which I did not read him until graduate school. So I like a lot of people, and probably some people listening right now, my understanding of Conan the Barbarian was Arnold Schwarzenegger movies.
Yeah.
That's what it was. And the idea that there was some actual writing behind this that'd be worth your time was not something that was on my radar. And so I was actually in graduate school at Ave Maria University when a professor, I was just looking for something to read because, one of the problems was that I had matured in my own Catholic faith. I was getting a theology degree down there. I was reading St. Thomas Aquinas. And the problem I was having is that I realized everything I was used to reading was very vapid. And it was ruining narratives for me because I just, the subplots and how characters made decisions, and I found it all just very flat. And so I was trying to find something new. And so that one of the professors was like, oh, well, you should, read Robert E. Howard. I'm like, what'd he write? Oh, Conan the Barbarian. And I was like, is this a joke? Why would I read this? And they're like, no, just trust me. And they explain it's wonderful, this barbarism and vitalism, and it's so contrary to our modern sensibilities, you're gonna love it. I'm like, okay. So I pick it up, and like you said, the thing that stands out immediately is Howard's capacity to draw you into a story. I mean, you said his descriptive powers, he just sucks you in, and you're in the second paragraph and you're in the world. You're trying to figure out what it is. And he just writes very, very well. So even if the topics are somewhat simple, what'd you read a story about? Oh, it's a barbarian who's trying to steal a jewel. Well, that sounds, highly intellectual. But actually, the story is so good because he is such a good writer.
Yeah. No, that's very true. And he wrote very fast, and he wrote as a passion, but he also wrote to make money. And most of his stuff he wrote, to fit the market. So most of his stuff are short stories or novellas. He he wrote a few novels or a few things that approach novel length stuff, but most of the stuff had to be written within the constraints of the market that he was working. It's actually ironic when you look back at a lot of his work getting rejected. Even Weird Tales would reject his stuff when, like, the stuff they were rejecting today, we say, actually, that's like a good story. Why did they reject it? But they were kind of weird. They did the same thing with Lovecraft. They rejected some of Lovecraft's most famous and today well-regarded stories were rejected by Weird Tales.
That's fascinating.
By the way, also published a lot of schlock. Today we think of Lovecraft, Howard, Smith in Weird Tales, but most of the stuff they published was really lousy. And in fact, the most popular writer in Weird Tales was not them, not any of those three. It was another guy who actually is interesting, but is far inferior of a writer compared to Howard or Lovecraft, or even, I would say, Clark Ashton Smith. It's a guy who was an undertaker and wrote kind of occult detective stories, a guy named Seabury Quinn, who is fun to read, but much inferior to these other three.
Anything else about, like, his childhood? Like, my understanding is that, I don't think his mother and father got along. I think at one point they actually split up. His father, I think, was a physician. I think my surface level understanding is that both of them really kind of impacted him in different ways. I was reading something that he actually would accompany his father at times as a child, and so that he actually saw some of these, like, oil rig injuries, like, injuries done to violence, etc. Like, he had exposure to that. Yeah. And I think his mother is the one that gave him his love of writing, correct?
His mother encouraged his love of writing. His mother encouraged him his love of poetry. She would read poetry to him. He was very influenced by his upbringing, or the image that he had of his upbringing of kind of dark Irish background, Scots-Irish, Protestant, not Catholic, Texan, but also deeply influenced by saga, by poetry, by legend, all of that. And an omnivorous reader. One story he tells how in the summer he would ride his horse and raid school libraries, breaking into them and taking books to read, and later returning them. So very influenced by his mother. His father was a doctor, a kind of country doctor who was always kind of on the road. So he was attached to his mom, and she encouraged him, to kind of be artistic in that way. And that had a big influence on him. Yeah, and his father also, yes, indeed. There's in one of the letters, I think he talks about that, how he got to see wounds, deadly wounds, stuff like that from accompanying his father. And also Boomtown, Cross Plains was an oil boomtown, so you saw all kinds of riffraff and, kind of sleazy life. And in fact, he says at some point, Conan is a combination of gunfighters, boxers, oil rig roughs, tough guys, ne'er-do-wells that kind of mixed in his head, and out of it came Conan the Barbarian. Of course, Conan being a name from both Irish and Brittany. There actually was a King Conan, a Duke Conan of Brittany, of Britannia, 600 or 1,000 years ago.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I in the summers in high school, I worked in rig up yards in Oklahoma, and so we'd build oiled rigs, like we were going to drill right there, made sure they work, and then disassemble them and send them out. So now that you make that connection, I just laugh because, you think about the beginning of the Tower of the Elephant, when he's just in this kind of like sleazy place, and all these people. Now those two are now connected in my head, and I find that to be hilarious. But he died young, and he was a suicide, right? Yeah. My understanding is that his mother was ill, and that after a certain point of hearing his mother's status, he walked out to his car and shot himself.
Yeah, that's true. He was not, he had, as far as I know, a kind of run-of-the-mill religious upbringing, kind of I think Baptist, I believe. I may be wrong, but kind of Southern Baptist kind of upbringing. But he was not a believer. He, he read Nietzsche. He read, he read all kinds of stuff. He was a sponge in reading, but he was not a person with a spiritual life. And he had his dark, his dark valleys. He's had a kind of grim view of life. He was very attached to his dog as a boy. He was alone a lot. He was with his mom, but he was actually alone a lot, kind of wandering the countryside with his dog Patches, and sad about his dog dying. And actually thought of killing himself when his dog died. And influenced very much by his mother's death. He was not, I think if things had gone a different way, he had a love affair that went bad with a young woman, a young teacher in town that did not go bad. He had the full weight of his mother's illness. And even though for the Great Depression he made a good salary, he had a kind of the weight of the bills of taking care of his mom as well. And so, he was in a dark place in his life at that time. And he seems that his father was afraid of that. And his father maybe hid his guns, but he got a gun from a friend, didn't tell him what it was for. And he killed himself. A great tragedy, because he was a person with some real, literary gifts, young guy. Who knows what would have happened? He wrote all of his stuff in his 20s. What would he have written in his 40s and 50s? Nobody knows.
Yeah, I agree. It's the same kind of thing. Like, what if he would have been able to meet up with Lovecraft? Like, what would have blossomed there? What could have come of that?
Or if he married, if he found a good woman, married her, and he would still have that driven need to write and also driven need to put food on the table, but it would have been channeled. Women have a way of civilizing men. So it's very tragic.
Yeah, I'd be interested too to see how his own writing would mature with this kind of, and we'll kind of get into, I think, some of his characteristics, but I'd be really interested to see how his writing would mature and develop under the context of fatherhood. Like if he ended up having his own boys, right? Because I think that's where a lot of his writings stand out to me, is to read these writings to young men, right? Because they are so much of overcoming hardships, of fortitude, of adventure, right? Of being brave. You mentioned, however, Nietzsche. That's really fascinating because when I read Conan, I've always found it to have kind of a Nietzschean underpinning to it. And I'm actually surprised that Howard hasn't become more popular as of late, with kind of the rise of this kind of like popular Nietzscheism and like vitalism that's come up. Do you have any thoughts on like how Nietzsche actually influenced his writing?
He was not a deep intellectual. He was something which is, I think, very admirable. And in my view, I don't know about Europe, but very American, or was very American, which is the bright young person. It's usually a boy who is an omnivorous reader, who is he goes to school, whatever school is, elementary, secondary school, but he learns from his reading. He learns from the library. He learns from the books that he reads. So Howard graduated from high school, but he's very much, I think, an autodidact, He was smarter, high school graduate, but he was smarter and better, better read than most of the people around him. But he was alone, he was alone. In fact, the famous biography, about him by the teacher, that young woman who was his strongest romantic relationship, is called One Who Walked Alone. And and you can talk about Conan as a kind of one who walks alone, although he becomes a king. That does seem rather Nietzschean, right? I have seen that. I think one of the kind of vitalist publications, I think Passages Press, is reprinting some of the works of Robert E. Howard in a 2-volume work. So maybe there is some kind of connection. Although Howard to me is a very American figure. He's a very kind of Western figure. And in fact, Lovecraft, when Howard died, Lovecraft wrote something like, I would have loved to have seen, I think he would have written the great epic of the American Southwest. The idea being that he might have written a Conan of the West, a kind of cowboy Conan, kind of a frontiersman. And in fact, Howard, near the end of his life, wrote several kind of both horror stories and adventure stories that had a Western, a Western flavor about them. So he might have gone kind of regional. Some people speculate that he would have become a kind of Louis L'Amour type of writer, Hard to say.
Yeah, no, very good. So before we kind of get into more of Conan the Barbarian, he had other characters, correct? So like what are some of the other like characters and facets that he explored outside of Conan?
Well, the first one that he wrote about, and it has different names because he kind of tended to take things. Sometimes he would rewrite them, submit them to a different publication. One of his earliest characters was a kind of tough American adventurer in the exotic East. Sometimes called El Borak or Francis X. Gordon, or their variations of that. And something he wrote when he first as a kid, and then later on he wrote kind of adult versions of it. He also wrote straight out medieval adventure works, which I think are among his very best work. I highly recommend this book. It's called Lord of Samarkand, and it's Howard's historical adventures. These are grim stories set in the East, in the Middle Ages, during the Crusades, or in the Balkans in Eastern Europe, kind of a lone crusader fighting hordes of Mongol warriors and stuff like that. Great stuff. This is not fantasy. This is just historical adventures, but they're very well-written stuff. This one is University of Nebraska Bison Press, has a very nice picture on the cover. But these stories are available in others of his books. So you have Francis S. Gordon, kind of early 20th century adventure in the East. You have his medieval crusading stories. You have his boxing stories. He was a big aficionado of boxing. You have his Western stories. You have his straight out horror stories, some of which are actually really good. Then another fantasy character, you could say his first fantasy character, which directly influenced Conan, is Hull of Atlantis. So he has a whole kind of Atlantean Hull books. And in fact, the first Conan story is a rewritten Hull adventurer. He takes Hull and rewrites him in the first published Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword, the first one to appear. And he has this Puritan adventure, kind of 16th century Puritan adventure, also very good. Loved it when I was a kid. Solomon Kane, who fights evil mostly in Africa, but also in Europe as well. And highly recommend his best Solomon Kane stories are actually very good. So you have a kind of, smorgasbord, of stuff. And then you have another kind of characters he wrote. He wrote a bunch of, they're not to my taste, but they were very successful at the time, of kind of comic Westerns, a kind of like Paul Bunyan type characters of a kind of big, fat Western ne'er-do-well, Breckenridge Elkins, Pike Beresfield, who have kind of Western tall tales. And those were actually very successful at his time. He actually had to, churn a lot of them out, and they paid well. But for living such a short life, it's amazing the huge amount of work that he produced. And his very best, whether fantasy adventure, historical adventure, horror, is really good. I mean, Stephen King was a big fan of one of Howard's horror stories, Pigeons from Hell. is highly regarded by Stephen King. He considers it to be a really outstanding horror story, and it is. It's quite shocking and impressive.
Howard's scope, like the breadth of his scope, is really impressive. Of just like different characters that he can create, and also just like really fun characters. I mean, you have the King of Atlantis, you have Conan the Barbarian. He has the other one too, that's like the Romans are coming into
Brad McMorn.
Yeah, that's of
the Earth. Tremendous story. That's a great story.
That's like one of his most famous, I think, actually, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you've got to love Solomon Kane. I mean, like this kind of like Puritan hero that goes around having an adventure and stomping out evil. I mean, these are wonderful stories. They're stories that I think capture the imagination, particularly of like the young masculine mind.
Sure.
So maybe not to play too many of my cards, but I'm just interested as we kind of shift into Conan. So someone finds out that you have this, or I think I had published something on a Send the Great Books podcast on X about who enjoys Robert E. Howard, and you showed off this phenomenal library that you have of him, right? Yeah, exactly. So if someone came up to you and said, why read Conan the Barbarian? Why this character? What would you say?
Well, I mean, if you like a good story, an exciting adventure story, vivid, well written, they're not too long either. I mean, I like long, but he for the reasons I mentioned, he didn't write long works. They're really well written and enjoyable. They're fun to read. When I served, I was an American diplomat. I served overseas, and we would get in the car to go somewhere. My boys, especially my eldest one, would give me something to read on the car. This is in the days before, handheld things. And I would give him Robert E. Howard. And, he'd read Conan or read Solomon Kane or whatever. And, it's boys' adventure, but it's actually more than that because it's well written and engaging. Sometimes, bloody, sometimes, super violent, but there's only Howard. A lot of people say this because there's a lot of stuff these days. For example, you can buy Conan novels written by people other than Howard. And the copyright holders allow that because there's only so much stuff that Robert E. Howard wrote, and he died a long time ago. But some people, some of the works are not so bad, some of the pastiches, but a lot of fandom, what people say is only Howard can write Howard. He has his voice was kind of unique voice, poetic, violent, grim, exciting. That's why you read it.
I think too, it's not simply that he has the veneer of good writing, which he certainly does. Like I said, he can draw you into a story. He's incredibly descriptive. I think he paints characters very well. But personally, I think he has some philosophies that are underpinning his writings that he is quite good at not telling you, but showing you.
Yeah.
And I want to point some of these out as we kind of work through the Tower of the Elephant.
Mm-hmm.
I've read, I can't remember, when I got into this, I think one or two people picked me up Conan books, maybe from used book sales or something, but they weren't Howard. They were someone else. And I read a couple of them, but they were always so flat.
Yeah.
Just here's a character and they're going to fight a giant monster. And you read it and it's just terribly, terribly flat.
Yeah, most of them are garbage, the non-Howard Conans. A few are written by decent writers who, write well. And I have favorites among them, but they're all inferior to Howard.
Well, I think one of the kind of maybe the shift into the story, because there's a few things about his writing I want to pull out, but I think maybe pull out examples from the Tower of the Elephant would be better. So I think this is one of his best stories. Now, I have not read the whole corpus. I would defer to your wisdom on this. But as someone who was new to Howard and kind of reading through this, I really enjoyed some of The God and the Bull, The Frost Giant's Daughter. Some of these are just really fun stories. But the Tower of the Elephant is the first one that I read that I was like, this is magnificent. This is just good. My intellect, my imagination is completely transported to somewhere else. I don't really know what's coming next. I've been totally sucked in to this story. I mean, this is a story that made me love Conan.
Yeah, it's the third published Conan story, but it's the first one of Conan as a young man. In fact, Howard says in a letter in his collected letters of Robert E. Howard, Volume 3, he says that Conan, at the time of Tower of the Elephant, was 17 years old. That he was a 6'1", 180-pound, 17-year-old barbarian. It's like, so although it's the third story published, it's the first one of the young, strapping, ne'er-do-well adventurer / thief, Conan of Cimmeria. And it's very compelling. And, it's the story is, as I'm sure we'll discuss, it's a heist story. And yet it's a lot more than a heist story, So it's a fascinating work with many layers, especially kind of the histories discussed and kind of the whole, kind of space and aliens. I don't know how much we want to get into the whole story, but
yeah, I think we should work through the story. But it has a lot of things going on, but somehow flows well. I mean, that's what's amazing about it, right? I think it actually flows well. Yeah, so just maybe like a few preliminaries there. One is, so it opens and he's in this like seedy tavern setting, which we've kind of described. And I think, again, Howard's writing is excellent at kind of showing you what this is like. But one of the things I think that really stood out to me as I reread it, and it was something that stood out to me even the first time, is Howard is very much painting a picture between the barbarian and the civilized man. Sure. So you get these examples in which Conan will ask something that seems very straightforward, and he's a very black and white thinker. And the civilized people, right, they look at him as a barbarian, from the North Wastes and things like this. And so, it's the civilized people that lie. It's the civilized people that speak out of, both sides of their mouth, that laugh at him when he doesn't understand, why he's being laughed at. I mean, what is Howard doing in this comparison where the civilized people are acting that way, and it's the barbarian who's the hero?
Well, of course, it's a little bit about himself or about his ambiance. This is a self-taught, really smart, well-read Westerner. And I think he's talking about Texans and, highfalutin Easterners and dudes who think that they're better than ordinary people. And I think there's something of that. Also, he admired the idea of the warrior and the Celtic warrior and all of that. But I think there's something of that, of the Texan. Of course, this is the story that includes that famous oft-quoted quote, which is from this story, Robert E. Howard quote. I'm looking at it down here. I wrote it down. Civilized men are more discourteous than savages because they know they can be impolite without having their skull split, as a general thing. Yeah, it's
a wonderful line.
And that's a famous quote. But Howard did think that the kind of civilizations do, and there's another Conan story where I think includes the quote, "The ultimate barbarism triumphs over civilization." And he had discussions with Lovecraft about this in his epistolary friendship, that civilizations have a way of kind of deteriorating, right? Of kind of becoming effete, of kind of imploding, of kind of feeding on themselves. And so he's kind of referring to that kind of Conan is a barbarian, he's a savage, but he's kind of clean compared to this kind of den of iniquity in Zamora, which he finds himself in, which is kind of perverse and dirty, and both physically dirty and kind of morally dirty as well.
Yeah, I mean, civilized man is weak, right? I mean, that's the picture that you get, that civilized man is weak. He's a liar. I mean, one of the things that you see with Conan is that, so in this, for instance, to use this story as the example, is he's just like, well, why doesn't anyone just go steal the jewel of the elephant, right? Why don't we just go steal it?
Yeah.
And they respond, they laugh at him, but what they're laughing at is that they think he's too stupid to understand like the dangers, which, I'm not saying that he understands the dangers fully, but the problem here then is that they're afraid.
Yeah.
Right. And their fear does not make sense to him.
Yeah.
And so civilized man is.
Yeah, because he feels that a brave man and a strong man, an adventurer, a warrior, a thief, whatever, he can find a way through no matter what. He can conquer. Conan is a conqueror at the end, right? So he kind of, again, I served in the Middle East a lot, and Middle Eastern people, this is a generalization, but Middle Eastern people, Arabs would say to me, they would say, one thing we love about Americans is that they're direct, dugri, They're not like us Easterners with our kind of, indirect ways and kind of sneaky ways. And I mean, this is a cliche, but you could kind of see that the civilization that Howard portrays is kind of like that. They're liars, right? They're corrupt, whereas he's very direct and to the point. And he thinks that, with his strength and his faith in his sword and his guile, that he can solve any problem.
Yeah, you mentioned Lovecraft earlier, because I had read something briefly that even Lovecraft actually had a lot of back and forth about the relationship between civilization and barbarism. Because in Howard, I mean, this is probably just like a general sketch, but in Howard, the barbarian seems to be the one that is better, that's good, right? That there's this kind of like just raw power, this fortitude, like let's overcome things, let's do this. I mean, to the point that sometimes Conan doesn't even understand. It's not like he's like, John Wayne said that, bravery was, saddling up even when you're afraid. At certain points, I don't even think Conan's even afraid. I don't think he has he doesn't even have like the intuition to be afraid of something. Whereas Lovecraft, you see, it's almost like the reverse, where for Lovecraft, civilization brings like a certain order and stability, but then like lurking underneath it is this barbarism, cosmic horror, like things we just don't understand. I thought that was really interesting to kind of juxtapose those two.
Yeah, Lovecraft was pro-Roman Empire. Howard was anti-Roman Empire. Some of Lovecraft's stories, I mean, I don't want to denigrate Lovecraft. I think he's a great writer. But in some of them, the hero faints from too much horror, right? In Howard, the hero sometimes the hair stands up because of the terror that he's facing. But Solomon Kane or Conan or whoever goes forward and confronts it bravely and obviously usually wins.
So and maybe this is a segue a little bit into how Howard uses almost prehistorical histories. There's some of this in Elephant of the Tower, or Tower of the Elephant, where he kind of lists out at the end, he's listing out all these different things. So when you say that he, wasn't a fan of the Roman Empire, like, is he favoring then like these more obscure, like pagan societies, or what would be something that he gravitates towards?
Well, I mean, he of course paints, he's a kind of pioneer in this as well. He paints a history, and he creates a whole history, and there's a whole history of the Hyborian Age, which is the age of Conan, which is a mishmash of ancient and classic history, right? So he kind of creates this world. As I said, he was heavily influenced by historical adventures, and he wrote historical adventures. But in his fantasy, what he does is he creates a fake or a fantasy historical world, influenced by real history, by legend, by writers like Jack London, his whole idea of barbarian tribes drifting through the world. So he uses that to kind of create a mock history. So you see it in the Hyborian Age, where Conan lives. There are civilizations which are similar to real civilizations. So there's a civilization in Conan's world which is similar to ancient Egypt, right? There's a civilization which is similar to Iran and medieval India of the Mughal Empire. There's a country which obviously Conan eventually becomes king of, which is somewhat like medieval France, you know. So that's what he does. You know, he uses kind of his knowledge and love of history, of world history, to create a kind of fake world building. He is a great world builder, something which we talk about in fantasy, right? Whether Tolkien or whoever, that they're great world builders. Howard was a great world builder as well, although his stories are short stories, mostly set in this imaginary world.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that. I think the fact that he can set that world and suck you into it very quickly, like I said, is part of his gift. I think too, I mean, tell me if you agree. So one thing to note here is that Conan's not necessarily like a hero, or at least not a hero like we think of him traditionally. Right? So like you said, this is a heist story. I mean, Conan's trying to steal something. So if you read it, you know, if you're reading it to your boys and stuff, like this kind of raises questions. And one of the things that to try and explain this to people, you know, what is Howard doing here? Is Conan, I mean, this is really Conan par excellence, I think. So Conan over here is, hey, here's this thing that cannot be stolen. And Conan's like, no, I can do that. No, I can overcome that. You know, it's almost like, you know, Conan shows up. I can't remember the story, but, you know, I think there's a part where Conan shows up and he basically steps up and sees that a war is going on, that two sides are fighting each other. And obviously he's going to join the fighting. So which side does he join? Well, he joins the side that's losing so that he can gain greater glory and overcome the difficulty of switching it. And I think that's part of his character, and sometimes that's where I see the Nietzschean influence. Maybe that's a popular understanding of Nietzsche, where it's just there's a part of the Conan stories that literally is just overcoming. I can do this, whatever it is, and sometimes the morality of it is set aside. Like I can have the inner strength, the raw power to overcome whatever this challenge is.
Yeah, I agree, and of course, Conan is an adventurer, and he's a fantasy version of. I actually wrote a piece in the European Conservative on Howard and Conan, I think a couple of years ago, where I make this point. He's a fantasy version of actually something which really existed, which is of people from a more barbarian or more primitive civilization becoming mercenaries or soldiers in the armies of a kingdom or an empire. They kind of get involved in, you know, they work for the king, or they become bandits, or they become thieves or whatever. You know, people like, you know, Robert de Guiscard, the famous Norman adventurer who carved out a kingdom in southern Italy, or, you know, in the Muslim world, you know, you have people who were slave soldiers, you know, like from the steppe, you know, Kipchaks, and who become slave soldiers in Egypt and then overthrow the king, and they become the sultan. And they're actually barbarians, and they can barely speak Arabic, and they drink lots of booze, but they're warlords over Egypt and Syria. That's what Conan is. Actually, Conan likes to drink too. You know, there are times when he's deep in his cups. So he's a fantasy version of actually something which kind of really existed in history at times, which is a kind of the rude foreign adventurer kind of pushing in the civilized society and making himself king or the power behind the throne, you know, with his own hands and with his own sword.
Yeah, no, very good. I like that. I like that historical antecedent. So, I mean, kind of to push into the narrative, right? So he's in this tavern. He overhears this. He, like we said, there's this kind of comparison that Howard's painting for us between barbarism and the civilized man. Conan kills the individual, you know, ultimately, and moves on. And he's going to go to the tower. He's going to go to the Tower of the Elephant. And so when we get this, and this is like this, the version I have is in certain parts, right? So this kind of pushes us into part 2. I'm interested, like, what do you think of Prom, the god, right? Because let me read a line here, because I think this seems to be just a very Howard-esque divinity. And so it says of Conan, his gods were simple and understandable. Crom was their chief, and he lived on a great mountain, whence he sent forth dooms and death. It was useless to call on Crom, because he was a gloomy, savage god, and he hated weaklings. But he gave a man courage at birth, and the will and might to kill his enemies, which, in the Sumerian's mind, was all any god should be expected to do.
Yeah, kind of Wotan or Odin kind of vibe there. You know, you're on your own. The gods have given you some strength, and you have to fight for it, and that's it. Yeah, that's very much the way he paints it. And you know, I'm not an expert on the religions of barbarian or savage peoples, but it seems like that kind of rings true to a certain extent. You know, kind of elemental gods. You know, they're not that interested in your personal fate. Your doom is your own, right? You're on your own, guy. That's very much the way Howard paints that. Yeah.
Yeah, what stands out to me of that passage, too, is that you have already been given everything that you need to overcome. Like, whether you or not you choose to use your gifts, whether or not you choose to have the fortitude and the inner strength and the outer strength, right, to actually overcome whatever death you're facing, that's your problem. I've already given you everything. So, yeah, Crom just seems like a just wonderful barbarian god. So he goes, as we kind of push the narrative forward, so he goes to the Tower of the Elephant, and he runs into someone, right? So now we kind of get this story. Taurus, is that what we're going to call him?
Taurus of the media, yes.
And I think that this is another, I mean, maybe this is that sword and sorcery side. I mean, I'm interested in what you say, because as they kind of adventure through the gardens, and you see that, like, Conan didn't plan this. Conan's like, oh yeah, there's that tower and no one can do it. Good night. Like, I'm off to go do it, right? Taurus has been planning this for a long time. Conan has this raw strength, this kind of like bestial nature to him. I love how Howard is constantly referring him back to a panther, right? He pads, his muscles are rippling underneath his skin. You know, he's very, very strong, but he's incredibly light on his feet.
Yeah, he's very different. By the way, that's very different than the popular image, a kind of Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? Kind of the muscle-bound hero. The way Howard portrays him is excuse me, he's very strong, but quick on his feet. Pantherish is the word that is often used. You know, he's fast, he's strong. I mean, the way I see him, he's more like, you know, more than like a tight end than an offensive lineman, you know?
Yeah, he's an incredibly athletic person. I mean, and Howard gives us little clues of that when he jumps over walls or lifts himself up or does these types of things. He not only does it with kind of a raw strength, but he does it, you know, almost, you know, well, cat-like, right? Panther-like. He just kind of slides in, right? He has the strength. But Taurus, I think, gives another contrast that I'm kind of interested about because, you know, again, Conan has these raw instincts, this power. He's very natural. Right, Conan is very natural, right? He just has the sword and the excellence of the human spirit and the human body. Taurus then is techne and like these dark arts and sorcery. And so it seems like Howard, once again, is giving us, you know, a contrast. And as we see, Taurus ultimately fails, you know, to penetrate into the tower, right? He dies at the top. So is there a juxtaposition here that Howard's kind of creating for us?
Well, Taurus is the prince of thieves, right? So he's a guy who's accomplished all these great thieving feats. And in fact, he mentions, a couple of them are mentioned, fascinating. Little bit, you know, it's like one line, right, on how he got a certain poison that they use. You know, a poison from the flower of the black lotus, how he got it. And then he mentions the rope that they use, the rope made from the tresses of dead women harvested at night and has it steeped in poisoned wine that makes them super hard. It's like one sentence, but incredibly evocative. So, by the way, there's there are a couple, there's another, I think it's in Black Colossus. There's another master thief who's accomplished all these feats and comes to a bad end. So Actually, Howard's written this more than once, but yeah, he's the kind of trope of kind of the clever master thief who's has all these wiles and stuff like that, but he does not come to a good end.
What's interesting too is that it's not necessarily that Conan is more clever than this man, because Conan just kind of goes waltzing up into the room that guy died in as well. But several times,
physically, he's much more capable.
Correct.
Taurus is described as kind of fat. He's fat with a big belly, but strong. He's a strong guy, kind of a big, burly master thief. Whereas Howard is this kind of, as a much faster, quick on his feet type of guy. That's what saves him, is I would say his athleticism, his speed and his strength saves him.
Yeah, he has an intuition, right? I mean, that seems how Howard presents Conan, is that it's not that he like figured out where the spider was, say, in the room, right? It's not that he saw these things, but rather like the hair on the back of his neck stands up, and he realizes that he has this like he's a panther. He has this predatory instinct, and so something tells him, and so he leaps. So it's interesting because it's still more bestial. It's like animalistic. So he has the raw strength and talent and agility to act, but then he has these intuitions, and that seems to be what he deeply trusts, which again is a contrast between these characters that are maybe surviving or trying to survive on being more clever than anyone else.
Yeah, it's his natural, you could say his animal instincts, as opposed to kind of the cleverness of the civilized person, perhaps.
I really enjoyed him killing the spider. I don't really know why, but I just enjoyed, because I think Howard, he just painted it so well. So you just imagine like Conan, caught in this web, and the spider thinks he's got him, so he's missiling himself across the room, and Conan just launches a treasure chest. And he writes really well about this thing just being cracked up against the wall, and the ichor and the ooze, coming out. It's a wonderful line. I mean, again, this is the thing, so if you read these knockoffs of him, like the barbarian killing a large spider comes off as very vapid and flat. But if you read Howard doing it, and somehow it becomes alive and has depth to it. And again, that's just
the original barbarian killing a giant spider is Howard. Everything else is a knockoff.
I like that. That's very good. So then probably the most, at least when I was a first time reader of this is where the story it takes a turn, and I loved it. Because, what happens? He's going down. So they've gone to the tower. So now they're coming down, and they thought that they would escape a lot of the defenses by doing that. And so he comes into a new room, and he sees what he thinks is, a demon of the elder world. And this is this creature. I'll hold it up for those that are joining on YouTube, because this edition has these wonderful, wonderful illustrations, right? So that when I turned the page and saw this, I was like, what is happening? So here's this creature, blind, with this huge elephant head and this somewhat emaciated humanoid body that he originally thinks is some type of statue until it moves. And this is really where, even in my kind of notes off to the side, before I realized they had a friendship, I wrote H.P. Lovecraft. Because he doesn't use cosmic horror. What's he say? Oh, it's a cosmic tragedy. The thing in front of him, this creature, he says, suddenly all fear and repulsion went from him to be replaced by a great pity. What this monster was, Conan could not know, but the evidences of its suffering were so terrible and pathetic that a strange aching sadness came over the Cimmerian. He knew not why. He only felt that he was looking upon a cosmic tragedy, and he shrank with shame as if the guilt of the whole race were laid upon him.
Yeah, he's an alien being tortured by an evil wizard.
Yeah, and it's such a fun turn. But even that, when the what's this creature's name again?
Yagkosha.
Yeah, when he Yagkosha.
The plastic Yag.
Yeah, when he starts describing oh no, are these? This is where it's very Lovecraftian, because it's not just hey, here's this creature from another dimension. No, this is a creature that actually came from our, physical realm, right? He flew through space. And this is where you kind of get that Lovecraftian, man is very small. man actually doesn't know what's going on in reality, right? There are things that man really has no idea about, that if he even starts to scratch the surface, like this creature, like this, he can't comprehend what's actually happening in front of him. They're too great for his mental capacities. And so I just love that, this has been very easy to say, oh, this is just a demon that's conjured. Oh, it's this. But actually, no, this alien race that flew through space on these great wings and then have watched.
Millions of years ago, because it's like it knew his ancestors. It knew Atlantis. It knew like these past civilizations. So it's not only an alien creature, it's a very old creature that's been on Earth a long time and kind of it was worshipped as a god. There's all this details about it. Is it really interestingly written and described.
It's really where you see, as we talked about earlier, like you see Howard's love for this kind of like prehistory history, if that makes sense, right? Because there's a long narrative where the creature is saying how they observed things, but they wouldn't interfere. And even the creature intuits what Conan thinks, because remember, he calls him an elder demon, like he has to be some kind of creature. The Yag, or this elephant creature, says, "I am neither a god nor demon, but flesh and blood like yourself, though the substance differ in part, and form be cast in different mold." So all of a sudden, it's like sword and sorcery, like fantasy story, we get an alien.
Yeah, an alien maybe from another dimension as well. That's why, it's not quite clear. Long living, here and there, it's not quite clear, traveled through space, kind of like Dumbo, Dumbo, but flying through space, but with this wisdom and magic and all this power.
Yeah, so there's a wonderful line in which, the creature is saying how, is it Yara? Yeah, how Yara, this kind of evil sorcerer, has, it tricked him, and then it's caused where he has to do his bidding. And so like it created the tower for him, it does these things for him, and every once in a while he comes in and tortures him, but he hasn't given up all his secrets yet. But he had a wonderful line where he says, "And for 300 years I have done his bidding from this marble couch, blackening my soul with cosmic sins and staining my wisdom with crimes, because I had no other choice." It's just one of those lines that just stands out to you.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it's interesting too that the creature then looks at Conan as the hand of fate.
Yeah,
which is fascinating, because here's a creature that is so different from us, but then still makes an appeal that there is a fate. You go back to what we talked about earlier, like the Homeric epics, right? That there is a fate that's moving all things towards their end and gives an intelligibility to history and to reality. And so here's Conan. He is the hand of fate. It doesn't, maybe again a little turn. It doesn't. You think he's going to free the creature? You think he's going to team up with the creature to fight against Yara? And what he has to do is actually kill the creature, to cut his heart out and squeeze his blood upon the actual elephant jewel.
The creature feels his face and knows that Conan that he's a barbarian, but that he's clean. He's not one of these minions of the evil sorcerer, that he's kind of his deliverer has come to free him by killing him, of course.
Yeah, it's just a wonderful, because it really, when you read it, at least for first time readers, and when I read it first time, you really have no idea where the story's going.
Yeah.
What's happening? Like, now he has to cut his heart out. He has to squeeze it. Obviously, there's this wonderful line where the jewel, absorbs the blood. We thought he'd run all over the table. And it's interesting too, because how Howard tries to present Conan in this, but his intuitions, like everything starts functioning off his intuitions. Does he trust the creature? Why does he do these things? Does he obey what the creature told him to do? And yeah, it just kind of goes back to like, there's some kind of primitive but very strong intuition that Conan the Barbarian has to do what needs to be done. And so we have this kind of funny ending in which, he's told to go take the jewel in front of Yara. He wakes him up, and, Yara comes over and holds the jewel and then shrinks to this like kind of comedic size to watch him running around and getting angry, and then gets sucked into the jewel itself. And we're just kind of left to believe that now the roles have reversed, right? That Yara will now be the prisoner, of this elephant creature who now has kind of returned to its former strength.
Yeah. Great ending.
It is a great ending. And then they run out, and this is one of those things too, where then like he doesn't even get anything.
Yeah.
Right? So he doesn't go out with a jewel. He doesn't have anything. He just has this.
I grab a ruby on my way out. Thanks.
Right. Yeah. There's not anything that he can actually even take, from these things. But no, it's a wonderful story. Anything else like on the story from your perspective, or anything kind of like to broadly introduce people to Howard that we haven't talked about?
No, I think it's a great story. It's the young Conan, so he's learning, but he has these abilities. He's strong, he's smart, he's good. He's not good. He's not a goody two shoes, but and he's not, as we discussed earlier, he's not a hero type. Sometimes he's a pirate, sometimes he's a bandit, but he has a certain, moral core, or has a kind of a warrior's code or a barbarian's code, that you see this, right? So he does this service. I mean, he doesn't have to do what, this hurt alien wants. I don't think it can force him to do it. Conan agrees to do it. So I think it kind of shows the kind of person that he is.
I like that. I like that a lot. What would you recommend next? Like, so for people who want to read more, maybe they enjoyed reading this story, like what would you recommend for people to read next, kind of in Conan or in Howard overall?
Well, Howard the Elephant is one of my favorite stories. My favorite story is called People of the Black Circle. It's an Eastern story. It takes place in the kind of mythical East, in Conan's bandit chieftain in that one. Also involves black magic and sorcery and all this stuff, and good guys and bad guys. Also beautifully written, also with a very powerful beginning. But they're all good. All the get a volume of the I think Del Rey Press paperback ones are the most common ones they have these days. They're three. That's the Conan stuff in 3 volumes. They're all good. Some Conan stories are good. Some Conan stories are great. You'll have your favorites. So I would say start with those. And as I said, I recommended others. I like his Crusader stories. I like the Solomon Kane stories. Depends what you like, but there's, his best is very good.
No, I really appreciate that. Yeah, this makes me just want to go back and revisit them. I read a lot of them over a summer and read very quickly. My boys, I've got 4 little boys running around my house right now. They're getting older. So I'm looking for things like this to kind of read to them and capture their imagination. Where can people find out more about like you and your work?
Well, I don't know, probably Twitter. I work, I spend a lot of my time on the Middle East. And so I write a lot about the Middle East. I'm vice president of the Middle East Media Research Institute, which is a think tank and research institute in Washington, D.C. I'm also a contributor to the European Conservative, where I write about, I wrote about Robert E. Howard. I write about kind of literary themes and books and politics as well. And I also write, as I said, for I contribute to the EWTN Empire. So that's EWTN Television and the National Catholic Register and the Catholic News Agency. So probably the best place to find my material is if you follow me on Twitter, although I often indulge in all kinds of nonsense and opinion and hot takes on stuff because, I spend too much time on Twitter and I should spend more time writing and doing other things. But
yeah, I think that's all of us. Yeah. Just come to Twitter. We think we're going to do something productive and just follow us for all our hot takes on things. I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So very good. No, I really appreciate it. I appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing, your love and interest of Robert E. Howard with us. I think you've sparked a lot of interest in this conversation. I'm excited to go back and kind of like revisit some of these stories. So thank you so much.
Thank you and God bless and all the best.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone. Next week, we are going to get started on reading kind of the Greek poetics. We did a year of Homer. And now we're going to read Hesiod's Theogony, and then we will get into Aeschylus's Oresteia. Check us out on X or thegreatbookspodcast.com to find out more information in our reading schedule. We'll see you guys next week. Thank you.